In the sprawling expanse of the Sonoran Desert, where the sun beats down mercilessly and survival depends on knowing how to read the subtle signs of danger, there lived a girl who had mastered the art of becoming invisible, not through magic or supernatural ability, but through the far more tragic skill of making herself so small, so quiet, so unremarkable that the world simply forgot she existed. Aiyana Crow Feather was 21 years old, though she looked younger, due to her slight frame and the way she carried herself, shoulders hunched, head down, eyes always fixed on the ground, as if the earth held secrets more interesting than the faces of the people around her. Her name meant Eternal Blossom in Apache, but there was nothing eternal about the way she moved through life, and certainly nothing blooming about her existence. She had learned early that eye contact was dangerous. It invited questions, attention, expectations, all things that had brought her nothing but pain throughout her life. When people looked into her eyes, they saw things that made them uncomfortable. Too much knowledge for someone so young. Too much sadness for someone who should have been in the prime of her life. Too much wariness for someone who had never been given reason to trust. The White Mountain Apache Reservation had been her home for all 21 years of her life. But home was a complicated word for someone who had never truly felt safe anywhere. She lived in a small trailer on the outskirts of the main community, a rusted metal box that leaked when it rained and turned into an oven during the summer months. It wasn't much, but it was hers, the first place she had ever lived, where she didn't have to worry about someone else's rules, someone else's expectations, someone else's version of who she should be. Aiyana's story was one that too many Native American women knew by heart, though few spoke it aloud. She had been born to a mother who was barely 16, a girl who had been failed by every system that was supposed to protect her. Her father was unknown or at least unacknowledged, and her mother, Sarah, had struggled with addiction and mental health issues that made consistent parenting impossible. For the first 8 years of her life, Aiyana had bounced between her mother's sporadic care and the homes of various relatives who took her in out of obligation rather than love. She learned early to read the signs of adult frustration, to make herself scarce when voices were raised, to survive on scraps of attention and affection that were doled out like precious resources in a drought. "Don't look at me like that," her mother would say during her lucid moments, when the weight of her own failures became too much to bear. "I'm doing the best I can." And Aiyana would drop her gaze, because even at 6 years old, she understood that her very existence was a reminder of everything her mother had lost, everything she had failed to become. Looking away became second nature, a survival mechanism that protected both of them from the uncomfortable truth of their situation. When Aiyana was 8, her mother died of an overdose in a motel room in Phoenix, and the girl was officially placed in the foster care system. The social worker, a well-meaning white woman named Mrs. Patterson, had tried to be kind. "You're going to live with the Johnsons now," she had said, crouching down to Aiyana's eye level in the waiting room of the Department of Child Services. "They're a nice family. They have other children. You'll like it there." But Aiyana had kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, already knowing that liking it wasn't really the point. Surviving it was. The Johnsons were indeed nice people, but they were also overwhelmed. They had 3 biological children and 2 other foster children, and their house was a constant whirlwind of activity, noise, and barely controlled chaos. Aiyana, quiet and withdrawn by nature, became even more invisible in the midst of all that energy. "She's such a good girl," Mrs. Johnson would tell the social workers during their monthly visits. "Never any trouble at all. Sometimes I forget she's even here." The words were meant as a compliment, but they cut deep. Being forgettable, being invisible, being no trouble at all became Aiyana's identity. She excelled in school because academic achievement was safe. It brought positive attention without requiring emotional vulnerability. She helped with household chores without being asked because usefulness was a form of protection. She never complained, never asked for anything, never made her needs known because she had learned that having needs was a luxury she couldn't afford. The foster placements changed every few years, sometimes because families moved, sometimes because they decided they couldn't handle multiple children anymore, sometimes for reasons that were never explained to her. Each transition reinforced the lesson that attachment was dangerous, that caring about people only led to loss, that the safest way to live was to expect nothing and depend on no one. By the time she aged out of the foster care system at 18, Aiyana had lived in 7 different homes and attended 5 different schools. She had learned to pack her few belongings quickly, to adapt to new rules and routines without complaint, and most importantly, to avoid eye contact with anyone who might see too much, expect too much, or demand more emotional availability than she was capable of giving. The transition to independent living was supposed to be supported by various programs designed to help former foster children, but Aiyana slipped through the cracks with the same invisibility that had characterized her entire life. She found a job at a small diner on the reservation, washing dishes and cleaning tables for minimum wage. The work was solitary and predictable, exactly what she needed. Her supervisor, an older Apache woman named Rose, was kind but busy, managing A restaurant that was always understaffed and operating on thin margins? "You're a good worker, Aiyana," she would say occasionally. "Reliable. I wish I had 10 more like you." But even Rose never really saw her, never looked past the efficient, quiet girl who showed up on time, did her work without complaint, and disappeared as soon as her shift ended. Aiyana preferred it that way. Being seen meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Her life fell into a routine that was as predictable as it was lonely. She worked 6 days a week, came home to her small trailer, ate simple meals alone, and spent her evenings reading books borrowed from the tribal library. She had no friends, no romantic relationships, no social connections beyond the superficial interactions required by her job. The books were her escape, her window into worlds where people formed deep connections, where love was possible, where happy endings existed. She read voraciously romance novels, literary fiction, biographies of people who had overcome impossible odds. But even in her reading, she was careful to maintain emotional distance. These were stories about other people, fantasies that had nothing to do with her own life. The closest thing Aiyana had to a relationship was with an elderly man named Thomas, who came into the diner every Tuesday for coffee and pie. He was a Vietnam veteran, a fellow Apache who had served 2 tours in Southeast Asia, and returned home to a world that didn't know what to do with broken soldiers. Like Aiyana, he was more comfortable with silence than conversation, and their weekly interactions consisted mostly of nods and brief exchanges about the weather. "You remind me of my daughter," Thomas told her one Tuesday, apropos of nothing. She would have been about your age now. Aiyana had looked up from wiping down his table, startled by the personal nature of the comment. For just a moment, their eyes met, and she saw a depth of loss in his gaze that matched her own. "Would have been?" she asked softly. "Car accident. When she was 16, Thomas said simply. Drunk driver. Sometimes I think I see her in young women like you, quiet, careful, watching the world like you're not sure you belong in it." The observation was so accurate, so painfully precise, that Aiyana had to look away. She finished cleaning his table in silence, and Thomas never brought up his daughter again. But something had shifted in that moment of connection, a recognition that she wasn't the only person carrying invisible wounds, that it was around this time that Aiyana began to notice changes in herself that worried her. The careful control she had maintained over her emotions for so many years was beginning to crack. She found herself crying for no apparent reason, feeling overwhelmed by simple tasks that had never bothered her before. Sleep became elusive, and when she did manage to rest, her dreams were filled with images of all the homes she had left, all the people who had forgotten her, all the connections she had been too afraid to make. The isolation that had once felt protective now felt suffocating. She would go days without speaking to anyone beyond the basic interactions required by her job. Her small trailer, which had represented independence and safety, began to feel like a prison. She started taking long walks in the desert, hoping that the vast landscape would provide some relief from the claustrophobia of her own life. It was during one of these walks that Aiyana first encountered the wild horses that roamed the edges of the reservation. She had heard about them. Of course, everyone on the reservation knew about the small herd that had been living in the area for generations, descendants of horses that had escaped from various ranches over the years. But seeing them in person was different. They were beautiful and free, moving across the landscape with a grace and purpose that she envied. But what struck her most was their wariness, the way they watched her from a distance, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She recognized something of herself in their careful vigilance, their reluctance to trust. "We're alike, aren't we?" she whispered to them during one encounter, careful to keep her voice low and her movements minimal. "We know that getting too close to people is dangerous." The horses, of course, didn't answer, but they didn't run away either. For several minutes, girl and animals regarded each other across the desert space, each recognizing a kindred spirit. In the other's wariness, these encounters with the wild horses became a regular part of Aiyana's routine. She would finish her shift at the diner, change into hiking clothes, and walk out into the desert to find them. She never tried to approach them directly, never attempted to touch or tame them. She simply sat at a respectful distance and watched, finding a strange comfort in their wild freedom. It was during one of these sessions, as she sat on a rocky outcropping watching the horses graze in the distance, that Aiyana first saw the man who would change her life. He was on horseback, moving slowly across the landscape with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there, even from a distance. She could tell he was different from the other ranchers she occasionally encountered. There was something in his posture, his way of moving, that spoke of patience rather than dominance. The man seemed to be observing the wild horses just as she was, but his presence didn't scatter them the way other humans did. If anything, they seemed curious about him, approaching closer than they ever had with anyone else she had seen. Aiyana watched this interaction with fascination, wondering what it was about this stranger that made the horses trust him. She was so absorbed in observing him that she almost missed the moment when he turned and looked directly at her. Even across the distance that separated them, she felt the impact of his gaze. For the first time in years, someone was really seeing her, not looking through her or past her, but actually acknowledging her presence. The sensation was so unfamiliar, so overwhelming, that she immediately looked away and scrambled down from her rocky perch, hurrying back toward the reservation before he could approach. But as she walked home, her heart pounding from more than just physical exertion, Aiyana couldn't shake the memory of that moment. Someone had seen her, really seen her, and instead of looking away in discomfort or disinterest, he had seemed curious, maybe even concerned. That night, for the first time in months, Aiyana found herself wondering what it would be like to be truly known by another person. The thought terrified her, but it also awakened something she had thought was dead, a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to spend the rest of her life invisible. She didn't know it yet. But the man on horseback was about to become the first person in her adult life to look her in the eyes and see not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but a human being worthy of care and protection. And when he finally spoke those words, "You're safe now," they would begin to heal wounds that had been festering for more than 2 decades. But that encounter was still days away. And for now, Aiyana could only lie in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling of her trailer, and wonder if she would ever be brave enough to look back when someone looked at her with kindness instead of judgment. Don't miss the next chapter, where you'll discover who this mysterious rancher is and why the wild horses trust him. Look, if you believe everyone deserves to be truly seen, and subscribe for more stories about finding safety in unexpected places. Daniel Whitehorse had spent the better part of 45 years learning to read the language that existed in the space between words, the subtle communications of animals, the unspoken needs of the land, and most importantly, the silent cries for help that some people carried in their eyes. As a half-Apache, half-Irish rancher who had inherited his grandfather's land and his grandmother's intuition, Daniel existed in the borderlands between worlds, which had given him a unique perspective on those who felt like they didn't quite belong anywhere. His ranch, the Double Eagle, sprawled across 2,000 acres of high desert country that bordered the White Mountain Apache Reservation. It was beautiful, challenging land that demanded respect and patience, qualities that Daniel had in abundance. Having learned them through years of working with traumatized horses and damaged souls, both human and animal, the ranch specialized in something that most people didn't even know existed: equine therapy and wild horse rehabilitation. Daniel had discovered his calling almost by accident 15 years earlier, when he had rescued a severely abused Mustang that everyone else had written off as irredeemably dangerous. The process of earning that horse's trust, of helping him heal from trauma that had made him violent and unpredictable, had taught Daniel more about patience, communication, and the healing power of unconditional acceptance than any formal education ever could have. Horses don't lie, Daniel often told the veterans, troubled teenagers, and trauma survivors who came to his ranch for therapy sessions. They can't pretend to be okay when they're not. They can't hide their pain behind social masks. If you want to help them heal, you have to be completely honest about who you are and what you're feeling. It was a lesson that applied to humans as much as horses, though people were generally much more complicated about accepting help. Daniel's own journey to this understanding had been hard. One, he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine, returning home with invisible wounds that took years to acknowledge, let alone heal. The transition from military life to civilian existence had been brutal, complicated by PTSD, survivor's guilt, and a profound sense of disconnection from a world that seemed to have moved on without him. His salvation had come in the form of his grandfather's dying wish. Joseph Whitehorse had been a respected elder on the reservation, a man who had bridged the gap between traditional Apache ways and the modern world with grace and wisdom. When he passed away, he left Daniel not just the ranch, but a responsibility. The land will teach you what you need to know, Joseph had told him during one of their last conversations. But you have to be willing to listen, and you have to be willing to help others who are lost, the way the land helped our people survive. At first, Daniel had thought his grandfather was talking about conservation, about being a good steward of the environment. It had taken years for him to understand that. Joseph had been talking about something much deeper, about creating a place where broken things could heal, where lost souls could find their way back to themselves. The wild horses had been his first teachers. The small herd that roamed the area between his ranch and the reservation had been there for generations, descendants of horses that had escaped from various ranches and adapted to life in the desert. They were beautiful, intelligent, and completely wild, which meant they were also vulnerable to those who saw them as problems to be solved, rather than beings to be respected. Daniel had made it his mission to protect them, working with both the tribal council and local ranchers to ensure they had access to water and grazing areas without coming into conflict with human interests. But more than that, he had studied them, learned from them, and gradually earned their trust in a way that few humans ever had. It was this relationship with the wild horses that had first brought him to the attention of the therapeutic community. A social worker from Phoenix had heard about his work and asked if he would consider working with a group of at-risk teenagers who had been failed by traditional therapy methods. Daniel had been reluctant at first. He was more comfortable with animals than people, but something about the request had resonated with his grandfather's words about helping the lost. The program had been a revelation. The teenagers, many of whom had been written off as hopeless cases, responded to the horses in ways that surprised everyone. The animals' inability to be fooled by false bravado or manipulative behavior forced the kids to be authentic in ways they had never experienced, and Daniel's patient, non-judgmental approach, learned from years of working with traumatized animals, created a safe space where healing could begin. Word of the program's success had spread, and soon Daniel was working with veterans, abuse survivors, and others who carried invisible wounds. He never advertised his services, never sought publicity. People found him through word of mouth, drawn by stories of a rancher who could help both horses and humans remember what it felt like to trust again. It was this work that had brought Daniel to the rocky outcropping where he first saw Aiyana. He had been tracking the wild horses, checking on their condition and ensuring they had access to the water sources on his land, when he noticed the lone figure sitting in the distance. At first he had assumed it was just another hiker or someone from the reservation enjoying the desert landscape. But something about the person's posture, the way they sat so still and watchful, had caught his attention. There was a quality to their stillness that reminded him of the wild horses themselves, alert, cautious, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. When he had turned to look more directly, he had been surprised to see a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with long black hair and the kind of careful posture that spoke of someone who had learned to make themselves invisible. Even across the distance that separated them, he could sense her wariness, her readiness to disappear if he made any move toward her. Daniel had extensive experience with trauma responses, and everything about the young woman's body language screamed of someone who had been hurt, who had learned that other people were sources of danger rather than comfort. When she had scrambled away after their brief eye contact, he had made no attempt to follow her. Pursuing someone who was clearly frightened would only reinforce whatever fear she was carrying. But he had thought about her often in the days that followed. There had been something in that brief moment of eye contact, a depth of pain that reminded him of the most damaged animals he had worked with, combined with an intelligence and awareness that suggested someone who was surviving through sheer force of will. Daniel began timing his visits to the wild horses differently, hoping to encounter the mysterious young woman again. He told himself it was simple curiosity, but deep down he recognized the same instinct that had driven him to help traumatized horses and troubled humans. Someone was in pain, and his grandfather's voice whispered in his memory about helping the lost. It took 3 weeks before he saw her again. This time, she was closer to the horses, sitting cross-legged on the ground about 50 yards away from where they grazed. The animals seemed comfortable with her presence, which told Daniel everything he needed to know about her character. Wild horses were excellent judges of intent. They would never tolerate someone who carried violence or predatory energy. Daniel dismounted from his own horse, a gentle gelding named Spirit, and sat down on a nearby boulder. He made no attempt to approach the young woman, instead focusing his attention on the wild horses and letting his presence become part of the landscape. This was a technique he had learned from his grandfather. Sometimes the best way to help someone was to simply be available without being threatening. For nearly an hour, they sat in parallel silence, both watching the horses graze and move across the desert floor. Daniel could sense the young woman's awareness of him, the way she monitored his position and movements without ever looking directly at him. It was the behavior of someone who had learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. Finally, one of the wild horses, a young mare named Luna, by Daniel, approached the woman. The horse moved slowly, cautiously, but with clear intent. When she reached the woman, she lowered her head and gently nuzzled her shoulder. The gesture was so tender, so full of recognition and acceptance, that Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Luna was one of the most skittish members of the herd, rarely approaching even him despite years of patient interaction. For her to offer such trust to a stranger spoke volumes about the young woman's character and energy. "She likes you," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying easily across the desert air. "Luna doesn't usually approach people she doesn't know." The young woman startled at his words, her hand freezing where it had been, reaching toward the mare's neck. For a moment, Daniel thought she might bolt again, but Luna's continued presence seemed to anchor her. "Luna?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what I call her," Daniel replied, keeping his tone gentle and non-threatening. "She was born during a full moon 3 years ago. I was here when it happened, watched her take her first steps in the moonlight." The young woman finally turned to look at him, and Daniel felt the impact of her direct gaze like a physical blow. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and filled with a pain so profound it took his breath away. But there was also something else there, flicker of curiosity, maybe even hope. "You've been watching them for a while," Daniel observed. "The horses, I mean, I've seen you here before." She nodded slowly, her hand now resting on Luna's neck. "They're beautiful and free." The wistfulness in her voice when she said the word free told Daniel more about her situation than any detailed explanation could have. This was someone who understood captivity, who knew what it felt like to be trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "They are," he agreed. "But freedom comes with its own challenges." They have to be constantly alert, always ready to run, never able to fully relax or trust. It's a hard way to live. The young woman looked at him sharply, as if she suspected. He was talking about more than just horses. Sometimes it's the only way to stay safe, she said. Sometimes, Daniel acknowledged, but not always. Sometimes there are places where it's safe to rest. People who can be trusted not to hurt you. They fell into silence again, but it was a different quality of quiet, now less wary, more contemplative. Luna continued to stand beside the young woman, occasionally nuzzling her hair or shoulder in a display of affection that amazed Daniel. "I'm Daniel," he said eventually. "Daniel Whitehorse. I own the ranch that borders this area." "Aiyana," she replied after a long pause. "Aiyana Crow Feather. It's nice to meet you, Aiyana. That's a beautiful Nemet in a blossom." She looked surprised that he knew the meaning, just as she had been surprised that he knew Luna's story. "You speak Apache?" "Some. My grandfather made sure I learned the language along with English. He said a man should know where he comes from, even if the world tries to make him forget." Aiyana studied his face, taking in his features for the first time. She could see the Apache heritage in his bone structure, the way he carried himself. But there was something else there, Irish, maybe, in the set of his eyes and the color of his skin. "Mixed blood," she said, not as a question, but as a recognition. "Half and half," Daniel confirmed. "Sometimes it feels like being caught between two worlds, never quite belonging to either one." "I know that feeling," Aiyana said softly. They talked for another hour as the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel was careful not to ask direct questions about Aiyana's life or circumstances, instead sharing stories about the horses, the land, and his work at the ranch. But he watched her carefully, noting the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way she positioned herself with clear escape routes, the way she seemed surprised by even the smallest kindnesses. When the light began to fade, Aiyana stood too. "Leave," Luna whickered softly, as if reluctant to see her go. "Will you come back?" Daniel asked. "The horses seem to enjoy your company." Aiyana hesitated, clearly torn between desire and caution. "I don't know," she said honestly. "If you do, you're always welcome," Daniel said. "And if you ever need anything, food, water, a safe place to rest, my ranch is just over that ridge. The door is always open." As Aiyana walked away into the gathering dusk, Daniel sat for a long time thinking about their conversation. He had worked with enough trauma survivors to recognize the signs, the hypervigilance, the careful positioning, the surprise at basic human kindness. Someone had hurt this young woman, probably repeatedly, and she had learned to survive by becoming invisible. But she had also shown remarkable courage in staying to talk with him, in allowing Luna to approach her, in sharing even the small details. She had revealed there was strength there beneath the fear and pain. The question was whether she would trust him enough to let him help her find it. Over the following weeks, Daniel made sure to visit the wild horses at the same time each day, hoping to encounter Aiyana again. Sometimes she was there, sometimes she wasn't, but gradually a routine developed. They would sit in comfortable silence, watching the horses, occasionally sharing brief conversations about the animals or the landscape. Daniel learned that Aiyana worked at a diner on the reservation, that she lived alone, that she had no family to speak of. He shared stories about his grandfather, his time in the military, his work with therapeutic horses. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something that might eventually become trust. It was during their fourth encounter that Daniel noticed the bruises on Aiyana's wrists, faint but unmistakable marks that spoke of someone grabbing her roughly. His jaw tightened with anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. Pushing too hard, asking too many questions, would only drive her away. "Aiyana," he said gently as they prepared to part ways that evening, "I want you to know that you're safe. Here, with me, with the horses, on this land. No one will hurt you here." She looked at him with those dark, pain-filled eyes, and for a moment he thought she might cry. Instead, she nodded once, quickly, and hurried away into the darkness. But Daniel's words had planted a seed. And as Aiyana lay in her narrow bed, that night she found herself thinking about what it would feel like to truly be safe. She had been surviving for so long that she had almost forgotten that there was any other way to live. Soon, very soon, she would discover that Daniel White was a man who kept his promises, and that sometimes the most healing words in the world were the simplest ones. "You're safe now." The foundation of trust is being built. Will Aiyana find the courage to accept the safety Daniel offers? Subscribe to discover how healing begins with a single moment of trust. The crisis came on a Tuesday evening in late October, when the desert air carried the first hint of winter's approach, and the wild horses had begun growing their thicker coats in preparation for the colder months ahead. Aiyana had been meeting Daniel at their usual spot for 6 weeks now, and while she still maintained her careful distance, something had begun to shift in the way she carried herself around him. She no longer startled quite so violently when he spoke, no longer positioned herself with quite so many escape routes mapped out in her mind. Luna had become increasingly affectionate with her, often approaching for gentle nuzzles, and even allowing Aiyana to stroke her neck and shoulders. The other horses in the herd had begun to accept her presence as well, grazing closer to where she sat and occasionally lifting their heads to acknowledge her with soft wickers of greeting. Daniel had been careful not to push, not to ask the questions that burned in his mind about who had hurt her and whether she was still in danger. He had learned from years of working with trauma survivors that healing happened on the survivor's timeline, not the helper's. His job was simply to be present, to offer safety and consistency, and to wait for the moment when she felt secure enough to reach out for help. That moment came sooner than either of them expected, and in a way that would test every skill Daniel had learned about crisis intervention and trauma response. Aiyana arrived at their meeting spot that evening later than usual, and Daniel could tell immediately that something was wrong. Her movements were more erratic than usual, her breathing shallow and rapid. Even from a distance, he could see that she was favoring her left side, moving as if something hurt. Aiyana, he called softly as she approached, not wanting to startle her but unable to hide his concern. She looked up at him, and Daniel felt his heart clench at what he saw in her face. There was a fresh bruise along her left cheekbone, partially hidden by her hair but visible when the evening light hit it at the right angle. Her lip was split, and there were scratches on her hands that looked like defensive wounds. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the words coming out too quickly, too rehearsed. It was the response of someone who had been forced to minimize their own pain for so long that it had become instinctive. "No, you're not," Daniel said gently, standing up from where he had been sitting on his usual boulder. "Someone hurt you." Aiyana's eyes darted around the landscape, checking for threats, planning escape routes. The wild horses, sensing her distress, had moved closer, forming a protective semicircle around her in a display of animal empathy that never failed to amaze Daniel. "It's nothing," Aiyana insisted, but her voice was shaking now. "I just, I fell. I'm clumsy." Daniel had heard those words before, from other survivors who had been conditioned to protect their abusers, to take responsibility for violence that had been done to them. He knew better than to argue with her directly. That would only make her more defensive, more likely to shut down completely. Instead, he moved slowly toward her, his hands visible and non-threatening, the way he would approach a frightened horse. "Aiyana, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are safe here, right now, in this moment. You are completely safe. Whatever happened, whoever did this to you, they can't reach you here." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty, the calm authority seemed to penetrate the fog of fear and adrenaline that surrounded her. Aiyana's frantic scanning of the landscape slowed, and her breathing began to deepen slightly. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, and the admission seemed to cost her everything. "I don't know where to go." "You don't have to know right now," Daniel said, continuing his slow approach. "You don't have to make any decisions or figure anything out. You just have to breathe and let yourself be safe for a few minutes." When he was close enough, Daniel could see the full extent of her injuries. In addition to the facial bruising, there were finger-shaped marks on her upper arms and what looked like rope burns on her wrists. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to maintain his calm demeanor. Aiyana needed his strength right now, not his anger. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. Aiyana's eyes filled with tears that she had been holding back through sheer force of will. "My supervisor at the diner, Rose's nephew, Marcus. He's been bothering me for weeks, saying things, following me home. Tonight he cornered me in the storage room after my shift. When I tried to leave, she couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to." Daniel understood enough to feel a cold rage settling in his chest. Marcus Yazzie was known around the reservation as trouble, a man in his 30s who had a history of violence against women and had somehow managed to avoid serious consequences through family connections and victim intimidation. "Did he ... Daniel began, then stopped himself. The specific details didn't matter right now. What mattered was that Aiyana was hurt, scared, and had nowhere safe to go. "I fought him off," Aiyana said, lifting her chin with a flash of the strength that had kept her alive all these years. "I kicked him and ran, but he said he knows where I lived. He said he'd be waiting for me." The words hung in the desert air like a physical threat. Daniel knew Marcus's reputation well enough to know that the threat wasn't empty. The man was dangerous, unpredictable, and had the kind of connections that made it difficult for his victims to find justice through official channels. "You can't go home tonight," Daniel said simply. "It's not safe." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Aiyana replied, her voice breaking. "I don't have family, I don't have friends, I don't have anyone." The words were like a knife to Daniel's heart. This beautiful, intelligent young woman had been so isolated, so systematically cut off from support systems, that she couldn't even imagine reaching out for help. "You have me," Daniel said, and the words came out with more intensity than he had intended. "You have me, and you have a safe place to stay for as long as you need it." Aiyana looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror. "I can't. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to owe anyone anything." "You wouldn't be a burden," Daniel said firmly, "and you wouldn't owe me anything. This is what people do for each other when someone is in trouble. This is what community means." The concept seemed foreign to her, as if the idea of unconditional help was something she had read about but never experienced. Daniel realized that in all her years in foster care, in all her interactions with social workers and temporary families, No one had ever offered her safety without conditions, help without expectations. "I'm scared," Aiyana admitted, and the honesty of the statement seemed to surprise her as much as it did Daniel. "Of course you are," Daniel said. "You've been hurt, you've been threatened, and you're being asked to trust someone you barely know. Being scared is the most natural thing in the world." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I need you to know something, Aiyana. I've spent the last 15 years of my life learning how to help people who have been hurt the way you've been hurt. I've worked with veterans who came home broken, teenagers who had been abused, women who had escaped violent relationships. I know what trauma looks like, I know what healing requires, and I know how to create safety for people who have forgotten what safety feels like." Aiyana studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. But all she saw was sincerity, competence, and a deep well of compassion that seemed to have no bottom. "What would happen?" she asked quietly. "If I came with you, what would happen? Tonight, you would get medical attention for your injuries, a hot meal, a safe place to sleep, and time to figure out your next steps," Daniel said. "Tomorrow, we would contact the tribal police about Marcus, help you get a restraining order if you want one, and start making plans for your long-term safety. Beyond that, we take it one day at a time. And you wouldn't. You wouldn't expect anything from me, you wouldn't want anything in return." The question revealed so much about what Aiyana had experienced in her life, the understanding that help always came with a price, that safety was always conditional, that her body and her autonomy were considered fair payment for basic human decency.